Welcome back, everyone. Today we've got a really fascinating explainer unpacking the theological and biblical foundations of marriage. Whether you're deeply familiar with these texts, or you're just kind of curious about the spiritual structures behind one of humanity's absolute oldest institutions, we are going to break down some incredibly rich source material today. So let's dive right in. To really wrap our heads around what the sources are saying here, we actually have to start with their central metaphor. These texts ask us to view marriage as way more than just an evolving social norm or some modern legal arrangement. Instead, they want us to look at it as a structure designed by a divine architect. And, just like any complex structure, it comes with a highly specific blueprint. The core idea is that if a couple wants their marriage to truly thrive, they need to consult the original designer's plans. Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The divine blueprint. 2. 3 spiritual purposes. 3. Understanding partner roles. 4. Egalitarian and complementarian views. And 5. A sacred covenant. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the divine blueprint, covenant versus contract. What's genuinely fascinating right out of the gate is this clear distinction the texts draw between a contract and a covenant. Think about it. In modern society, we generally view marriage as a contract, right? It's an agreement based on mutual benefit, and honestly, one that can be legally broken if the terms aren't met. But the sources emphasize that, biblically speaking, marriage is a sacred, God-ordained covenant. It's meant to weave two entirely independent individuals into one eternal unit. One of the texts uses this great visual of taking two separate threads and weaving them so tightly into one fabric that you can't pull them apart. It's a total foundational shift in how we view commitment. Moving right along to Section 2, 3 spiritual purposes, the why of marriage.
So what is the spiritual logic behind all of this? Well, the first primary spiritual purpose defined in the texts is companionship. Going all the way back to the Genesis account, God noted it was not good for man to be alone. So spouses are literally designed to mutually complete each other. I actually love the modern analogy one of the sources uses here. It compares a husband and wife to computer hardware and software. Standing alone, they might both be pretty impressive, but combined as a team, they accomplish so much more. They eliminate aloneness and completely activate the system.
The second purpose is procreation and legacy, and the sources illustrate this brilliantly, describing the family not just as a biological unit, but as a spiritual greenhouse. The idea is that the home is intended to be this deeply nurturing environment where children grow up absorbing character, values, and a true sense of spiritual mission. It's all about raising up the next generation to look at the world through a lens of faith and compassion, and then carrying that legacy forward. And the third purpose is mirroring God. The texts argue that humanity was made in the image of God, and the marriage union itself is meant to give the whole world a glimpse of divine love. Specifically, it's designed to reflect the loving, redemptive relationship between Christ and the church. So the really crucial takeaway here is that marriage is supposed to be a visible reflection of an invisible reality. It's showing a watching world what God's love actually looks like in practice. Okay, let's pivot a bit to Section 3, Understanding Partner Roles, the mechanics of the blueprint. Now, as we transition from those lofty spiritual purposes down to the practical mechanics, we absolutely have to establish the baseline. And every source completely agrees on this. Both partners possess absolute, unquestionable, equal dignity, value, and worth. Neither partner is inferior to the other in any way. They are both created in the image of God, walking side by side as true equals.
And this leads directly into the ultimate example the sources point to for both partners, which is Jesus Christ. Before they even touch on any distinct marital duties, the texts remind us that Jesus modeled sacrificial servant leadership. He washed feet, he laid down his life. Any concept of authority or submission in a biblical marriage is meant to be modeled entirely after this selfless, humble, and deeply sacrificial standard.
Which brings us to Section 4, Egalitarian and Complementarian Views, 2 theological interpretations. So how do couples practically apply all of this? The source material actually presents 2 primary theological frameworks when it comes to specific gender roles. As an explainer, we're going to look objectively at both views. On one side, we have complementarianism, which stresses distinct gender-based roles of male headship and female submission within that equal partnership. On the flip side, we have egalitarianism, which strongly advocates for mutual submission and entirely shared responsibilities across the board, without any gender-specific hierarchy. Let's break down how each side views the blueprint. First, looking at the complementarian blueprint. This perspective draws really heavily on passages like Ephesians 5. It teaches that while men and women are 100% equal in value, God designed a specific order with distinct roles. Husbands are called to provide sacrificial, loving leadership, literally loving their wives exactly as Christ loved the church. And in response to that, wives are called to respect and voluntarily submit to the servant leadership, acting as a supportive helper. The whole idea here is that these distinct roles perfectly complement one another to create a beautiful harmony.
Now, conversely, let's look at the egalitarian blueprint. The sources from this perspective argue that true biblical submission is actually a mandate for all believers to serve one another. So it applies completely equally to both spouses. In an egalitarian marriage, it's all about mutual self-sacrifice and reciprocal service. They argue against assigning duties arbitrarily based on gender, stating instead that roles should just be determined by need, ability, and pure love. In this view, mutual submission naturally creates a thriving, healthy partnership without the need for hierarchical authority.
Finally, Section 5, a sacred covenant, daily application and grace. Because let's be real, regardless of which theological framework a couple leans toward, we have to talk about the daily grind. Who pays the bills? Who takes out the trash? The texts get incredibly practical here, emphasizing that defining clear, mutually agreed upon roles and responsibilities is an absolute game changer for reducing conflict. It just eliminates those awful misunderstandings like, oh, I thought you were going to take care of that. Healthy boundaries and crystal clear communication are essential tools for applying this divine blueprint on, say, a random Tuesday night when the sink is just full of dirty dishes.
And hey, disagreements are absolutely going to happen. When they do, the texts offer this brilliantly structured framework for decision-making. You start at step 1 with biblical absolutes, God's unchanging moral laws. If the Bible doesn't give a direct command there, you filter down to step 2, organizational norms, like guidance from your church. Then step 3, house rules, the boundaries you've literally set for your own family. And finally, step 4, personal preferences. The sources really highlight the vital need for prayer, for seeking wise counsel, and for recognizing that, honestly, a lot of arguments are just clashing preferences, not absolute moral failings.
But the sources are also incredibly realistic. They completely acknowledge that applying this blueprint is hard. Living in the earthly kingdom means you're going to face conflict, financial stress, sickness, and clashes of temperament. One source beautifully notes that the joy of marriage actually often comes through the via dolorosa, the way of suffering. It takes deep, sustaining grace to maintain this permanent bond. It requires daily forgiveness, hard work, prayer, and profound tenderness to overcome those trials and keep the covenant completely intact. Which brings us to our final thought. We've explored the architect's blueprint. We've looked at those 3 primary spiritual purposes, companionship, procreation, and marrying God, alongside the different views on partner roles. So the question I want to leave you with today is this: how does your own relationship, or maybe the relationships you observe around you, reflect this divine design? Does it mirror that ultimate example of selfless, sacrificial love? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep exploring, and I will see you next time.